Hey, all right.
Testing.
All right. All right,
Okay.
the live stream is up. The live stream
Okay.
is up.
We
We
are
all
live.
right. We are live. We are live. Yes. All right. So here we go. So let me just double check and make sure that we are on Facebook. We are live everywhere. We are on YouTube. Again, do I see it? I'm not seeing it yet. Internet is slow here. Let me see. Nope, hold on. It's not showing up yet.
What's our overall time, just so
So
I
we
can
should
keep track?
should be about an hour.
Okay, about an hour. All right.
It's not showing up. Hold on. Let me see what's going on here. Wait. There. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. It looks like it's working now. Okay. There we go. Phew. All right. Half a day total Samzugueno Hudzung Estigi Nuebuna episode Fanatsu. This is a new episode of Fanatsu. Half a day, half a day. Guahui host Mitsutatlu. Si Miguel Michael Lujan Bavakwa. Once again, I am your host for this episode of Fanatsu. And we are bringing back with us somebody that we haven't had on Fanatsu for about 5 years now, since before the pandemic. And somebody who, when we brought him on 5 years ago, a lot of you really appreciated the wisdom, the perspective, and the solidarity that he shared. And so, you know, uh, I reconnected with him. We ran into each other at FestPac, the Festival of Pacific Arts, in Hawaii in June earlier this year. And so, I asked him if he wanted to come on and also then update us on what is going on in his islands in American Samoa. And I'm grateful that he was eager to come back and be in dialogue and talk to us about what's going on in American Samoa. And for those of you listening, we can talk and we can share about what's going on in Guam. But here we have with us, see Dan Anga, Dr. Dan Hafaday.
Half a day.
And so, if you have been following Fanatsu, then you know that Dan here has been involved. He has been involved in issues of political status in his island for a while now, serving in different capacities, kind of serving in different capacities in the government and in the community on this issue. And so that's why, I wanted him to come here and talk to us about what's going on in his community because when we talk about American colonialism, when we talk about American territories, it's important that we remember that each of us is different. We don't want to imagine that every US territory is the same, and therefore each of our paths is the same, whether in the past or looking ahead into the future. We don't want to think that we've all experienced the same thing, but we don't also want to imagine that all of us imagine the same future, that the one size fits all approach that sometimes the federal government uses for territories or assumes in ignorance for territories. We don't want to assume that in solidarity with other territories. We need to understand what is the experiences for each of us. Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, the CNMI, Guam, and so on. And so that's why I'm grateful, uh, for Dan here, that he has joined so that he can talk to us about what is going on. What is the conversation like in in American Samoa about their issues of political status? Because in Guam, we've had the decolonization conversation for a little while now, but it moves ahead a few steps, it moves back a little bit, it moves ahead a little bit, it moves back, and so on. And so it's important to get the perspective of other places and how they are dealing with what it means to be a territory of the United States. And so, Dan, Sidzus Masi, thank you so much again for joining. It's good to see you virtually. It was nicer to see you in person in Hawaii for FestPac, but it's good to see you virtually though.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael Bivakwa. I think we first met at the United Nations Committee of 24 meeting in St. Grenadine, is it? Yeah,
Or
2017.
or maybe even in Nicaragua earlier than
You were
that.
in Nicaragua? Okay, that's
I
when we
think I
first met.
was. I think I was. Yes.
Yeah, so that's when we first met, and then I was in Guam 2019. So that picture that you showed me, that was me about 5 years ago. But what's interesting to me is the ula, well, I don't know what the Chamorro word is for the lei, the
Yeah.
necklace kind of
Uh-huh.
thing. So I'm thinking, so that's where that came from, because I still have it in my house,
Oh.
and I wear it around to different places, thinking it's Samoan, but now I've been reminded, no, that was the ula I got from Guam. So thanks for showing that picture.
Oh, no
It's good to be
problem. No problem.
reminded, where that came from. Um, well, there's just not enough time to go over everything, but you did touch on the Festival of the Arts. So I'm going to say a little something, and then maybe I'll swing back to you, because that would be a good point of dialogue. Um, one of the things I want to talk about is kind of a search for the narrative. What is the narrative, especially for the native peoples of the Pacific? And what I mean by that are the Hawaiians, Samoans, and Chamorro, which in the case of the Western Pacific is both Guam and CNMI. And we're all familiar with the, let's call it the founding fathers narrative of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, uh, that all men are created equal. But at the same time, there was what is often referred to as the original sin in the founding of America, of slavery and so on. And that's a whole different narrative, really. And what's contained in that narrative is something we're going to be discussing or talking about. Then there's this third narrative that I call the mother of all injustices. I heard that phrase on West Wing. You remember that series, West Wing? The mother of all injustices. And that's about uh, the Native Americans. So my question, I think, for us is, so what is the narrative of the Pacific Islanders? Is there a narrative, or have we just lost it all? And recently, I heard about an Asian Pacific Islander meeting, a big meeting. And after the meeting, the Pacific Islanders were totally kind of demoralized. It's like, hey, we didn't really have a voice in any of that. So it doesn't really fit. So, and our narrative is not the same as the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico. So I'm really talking about the Pacific. And I think the reason why it's good to bring up FestPac, because remember opening night, Mike, and and if anybody asked me and people have it, so how was opening night? And of course, for me, it was the opening ceremony, right? And all of the Pacific Islander countries and were there presenting themselves, and I was just couldn't believe it. It was really something to see. But the word that came into my mind is survival. That the Pacific Island people have survived in spite of everything. And yes, that was a celebration, but it was also important to remember that because it was a festival of the arts, that the expression of Pacific Island peoples has survived. And I came to one of the sessions where you had those young poets from Guam. And I also, as a teacher, critical thinking is an important part of figuring out what the narrative is. So, what do you think about that, Michael? Is there a Pacific Islander narrative, with the U.S. territories? I know there's the freely associated states too, but the situation with Hawaii because of the court cases, Cayetano v. Rice, and with Guam, Guam v. Davis, and CNMI, Weibo v. Villacrucis. Those three court rulings have really created a kind of a threat to a strong, clear, authentic Pacific Islander narrative for us.
No, I would, yeah, I think the way that I think it's interesting the way that you framed the start of this conversation because, even in terms of the sins of the United States, just because, the United States is in some ways reckoning with uh some of those sins, right? You know, slavery, Native American displacement and genocide. But then the territories represent something which it it struggles to even recognize as an issue, right? Because small islands, far away places, and then people, people who and then islanders bodies who kind of exist to serve, to play football for you or to cook for you or to serve you drinks, and then places that have nice beaches or to give you military bases in the case of Guam, right? And so that makes it tougher to get like a conversation around our islands that's meaningful because we're so far away. There's so fewer of us, and so to penetrate the American imagination is tough, in a meaningful way, because we always kind of get reduced to just the tiny islands. I mean, I think
Mm.
it was during the time of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, when talking about Micronesia, when they were doing nuclear testing there, and then talking about like, well, what's going to happen to these people in the future, and then Kissinger allegedly said, "Oh, there's only like less than 100,000 people there. Who gives a shit?" And
Yeah,
so that's part of the difficulty in this conversation, is that for the Pacific, it's always the smaller amount of people, and the for us the stakes are high. It's life and death. But for the rest of the world, it's either it's a dot on a map, or it's a tropical vacation and a mai tai
yeah,
or something like that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
but please go ahead.
Well, I agree with you. We're dealing with this scale of sorts. I think that's where Epeli Hau'ofa comes in, and the way that he reframed who we are as Pacific Islanders. It's not just a bunch of small islands in the big ocean. We are the caretakers of the Pacific. Um, and he said much more, but so we can think about this in a different way. Uh, but to answer the question I posed, what would be that Pacific Islander narrative? I just asked myself, what are the foundations of a Pacific Islanders narrative? And as we know in the Declaration of Independence, they talk about a self-evident truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what are our self-evident truths? So I'm speaking as a Samoan now. What are the self-evident truths of the Samoan people? And it's a little bit hard because we didn't have a written language. We don't have the documentation that spelled it out for us, right? Uh, we weren't a national government. We weren't trying to form a national government. So how do we express our own self-evident truths? And this as someone who works for a museum, we rely on ancient myths and culture, right? Our oral traditions, our proverbial expressions, our localized culture. And so there's a Samoan saying called ele onimotu tu'ufua. Ele onimotu tu'ufua. When they speak of the Samoan Islands, they're saying, hey, these were not abandoned islands. These were not forsaken islands when the Dutch, French, and British came. And as you know, Michael, there was the colonial doctrine of terra nullius, that these were empty lands. And until they discovered us, right, these were just empty lands. But Samoan saying is no, these were not empty lands. There were already people living in Guam, Guahan. There were already people living in Saipan, in Samoa, and in Hawaii. And they had a language. And sociologists and linguists who study languages thanked, I'm going to thank them, because these are not primitive language. In fact, there's no such thing as a primitive language. Every single language has this very complex linguistic culture and grammar and vocabulary. So we had our own languages. I mean, besides to mention our own foods, our own culture, our own music, our own arts, and that's why for me to see all of the arts, the singing and dancing may have looked like uh, for people who only look at it as a commercial enterprise. Well, they see one thing, but I'm sure you and I see something else. Uh, it's no mistake that the Hawaiian culture survived in the hula. And it's no accident that Chamorro today, I mean, based on what I've been told, they had to reclaim their dancing and their arts and singing. I mean, you have to reclaim what was once yours. And dancing, if it's dancing, it's dancing. I mean, you know, and I think when we ask what are the foundations, we have it in our old traditions. And this whole idea of the West coming and finding empty places, they're still doing it today. They go out to some place out, some back part of the island, and oh, these are just empty lands. But the more I think about it, Michael, those are not empty lands. Maybe they weren't navigated with surveyors and measured out in speed. No, those were sacred lands. I mean, how many times have we heard this happen? Oh, they're digging up a place. Oh, there's some bones here, human bones. Or they're digging up a site. Sorry guys, we just dug up your, right? And so I think the native peoples had a much wider sense, a much more knowledgeable sense of the islands that they lived on than the way it's been portrayed in Western literature and Western history.
Oh,
So I'll
that's a
pause there for a minute.
no, that's a wonderful point. Thank you so much. Because and thank you because my point was too focused on sort of how outsiders see us and how it kind of limits us. But your point is really how can we build from within, from what's there? How can we kind of draw upon our own foundations? And that's absolutely necessary because people will see us as small, people will see us as this or that, but what is in our history, our culture, what's in our islands already that we can use to see us as stronger, as larger. And your reference to Epele Heofa is an important one because that's really a defining work to see the ocean to remind ourselves that the ocean does not hold us back, that sort of that outsiders, people who grew up where the ocean was like the fantastical mythical thing that you would see oh my goodness, there's the ocean, that didn't grow up near the ocean and that didn't understand the ocean, didn't live with the ocean, that for them the ocean was this thing that you had to conquer and it like held you, it inhibited you. But then, that's one of the legacies of the peoples of the Pacific is the first to conquer the ocean. And so that's why when when I'm always talking to students about like the world, the future, I'm always saying, you know what, we were the first people to conquer the Pacific thousands of years before Europeans did it, thousands of years before the empires of Asia or the West, the East or the West did it. We were conquering the ocean. We were navigating it. We were learning to respect it, but learning to use it to travel and explore more than any other peoples in the world had. We should remember that, and then we should think about what does that mean for today? What does that mean
Yeah.
then in terms of islanders, tackling the world around us, you know?
Hey, climate change, you know,
Exactly.
we,
Exactly. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, the issues, I guess you could call them the Pacific wide, the Pan-Pacific issues today really have to do with the climate, the ocean. It's still here. Um, but I'm gonna go to this next topic now, Mike. The U.S. citizenship case, because it's something that's current. There were actually two cases, Fiti Semanu versus USA, and no, the first one was Tuaua versus USA, and the second one was Fiti Semanu USA. And I'm going to try to explain what I think happened. So for those of you who, there was a case where, as I think all of you know, if you're born in American Samoa, you're born a U.S. national. We're not U.S. citizens by birth like all the other territories. And part of what's the reason for this is these Supreme Court cases called the insular cases. Those were the court cases that uh, set up the difference between an unincorporated territory and an incorporated territory. So that's how Guam and CNMI and American Samoa are the same. We're unincorporated territories. And so the US Constitution doesn't apply in full. So the right to US citizenship does not apply to American Samoa. So there's a big US citizenship case. And ah, what we often heard from this side, for those who are pushing for US citizenship by birth, hey, don't those people in Samoa know they're second class citizens? Don't they know that they're just a colony? Ah, this is the right thing for them. They need to become US citizens by birth. That was kind of the arguments coming from that side. But I want to explain that that's only one side of the picture. And there's this word ethos. Sorry to put out that big word there, Mike, ethos. um, so I want to start by saying that both sides are legitimate. The Samoans in the States arguing for US citizenship by birth have legitimate cause to change the law and overturn the insular cases. But I think the people back home also had a legitimate reason for not wanting US citizenship, in spite of the fact that we may be second class citizens. And of course, in some ways, we may be a colony, but it's a little bit more than that. And so I think one of the main differences you have Samoans who were born and raised in Samoa, right? And then since the 1950s, since after World War II, we had this migration of Samoas to Hawaii, to the West Coast, and now all across the USA, the diaspora, right? And the difference is, or one way to think about the difference is the Samoans in the States have solved the US citizenship case from a political ethos, whereas the Samoans on island viewed it in a cultural ethos, in a cultural sense. And so for the Samoans off island, and I absolutely agree with them, it's about the quest for equality. Okay. Of course, all individuals, all US citizens should be treated equally. I mean, who can disagree with that? For the people back home, back in Samoa, I, we use the word equity. The difference between equality and equity, something that you could explain more. And the argument put forth by the lawyers on this other side was that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, according to the 14th Amendment, guarantees equal protection, right? That everybody should have equal protection of laws, no matter if you're in Guam, American Samoa, or, or CNMI. There's another side, and that's why I talked about these narratives earlier. I think the 14th Amendment, because it was passed right after the Civil War, falls under the narrative of racial equality. Uh, it was the country's answer to slavery. But I think where the people back home, people living on the island, the indigenous people, I think the narrative that fits better for us is the narrative of the Native Americans. We are the native peoples of these islands. Okay. And the reason why we need to be clear about what our narrative is and what our foundations are, because our story is more like that of the Native Americans. And the Native Americans have a constitutional exception. They have their pieces in the Constitution that give them that protect their rights as Native Americans. Another big part of this issue is racism. Okay, well, American Samoa, you guys are defending racism. If you don't want to overturn the U.S. insular cases, that means you're racist. That was coming out in the national media a lot, and that our land laws, for example, are constitutionally repugnant. That's the kind of phrasing, or there's no more clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. From the point of view of a cultural ethos, we are fighting we believe that the preservation of Samoan lands is a compelling interest. Okay? It's something we have to do to survive. I think the Samoans living in the States have less to lose, whereas we in the islands have everything to lose. And that's why this case for us was an existential threat. It's a very threat to our existence. Whereas there may have been little or no risk for the Samoan diaspora because they have a place to stay. For us, it was a high risk situation. Okay. And not only that, who was really being served by this case? And I kind of got into trouble for saying this. I did express my personal opinion. See, make sure that maybe those individual Samoans who took the case believed or were led to believe they were the passengers. And overturning the insular cases was just a vehicle. But Mike, I think time has proven it's the other way around. These Samoans were the vehicle, and the insular cases was the real passenger. That's what, is it Neil Ware and Equally American and organizations like that? That's what they were really after. What are they doing for these individual Samoans now? Are they helping them to get their rights in employment or housing? That's what they wanted to overturn the insular cases. And in some sense, these Samoans were used. I'm sorry if that offends everyone or anyone, but that's part of what happened. I'll pause there.
No, no, thank you for putting this perspective out there because I think it's critical, and not just from sort of the perspective in American Samoa, but it's also important that all the territories kind of reckon with this reality, is that sort of the diaspora has, every territory of the United States has growing diaspora. For the Chamorro people, there's far more. There's far more people that have left sort of the Marianas that are in the United States. And so, the stakes, as you mentioned, are a little bit different because whether you are in the Marianas or whether you are in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. But, for American Samoa, the stakes are different because of the national situation and then sort of traditional, land laws and stuff like that. But still, there has to be the issue of, should the, you know, should the interests or of those who are in the diaspora determine those of, determine the realities, the future of those who are still in the islands? And how involved should the federal government be in that conversation? And if the federal government or some justices get to determine that, that's not self-determination. And that's part of the problem in this, is that if and so but so yes, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Um, I put something in the chat for you,
Okay.
because I don't want to read it too much. Um, you're right. The other part of this was that the courts would have decided, right? The courts would have decided whether we should become U.S. citizens or not, versus an electoral process, right? Where the people of Samoa uh, can decide for themselves if this is the right thing for them. And for us, it's about having the safeguards. You know, the new generation doesn't always think the same as the old generation, Mike. And so I'm just like saying, okay, hey, that's right, I hear you, but can we make sure these safeguards are in place? And one of the things that the younger generation they've expressed discomfort with is being accused of racism, you know. And you'll see that there's a great article by Andy Rotnick, and he talks about the difference between ancestry and race. And the court cases that I cited earlier uh, have made ancestry and race equivalent, or at least they've really like made it go in that direction. And he's saying they are not necessarily equivalent. And the problem with this argument is that when you equate race uh, with ancestry, you don't look at the historical history of colonialism, the historical wrongs, and it doesn't account for the protection of the indigenous people's unique cultural and political status. And so, as far as finding a foundation, I'm just going to send one more piece in here, uh, and because these people say it far better than I can. um, that it's not a racial classification; it's a political classification. Native American tribes are considered distinct political entities, and land rights are often tied to tribal membership rather than race per se. The CNMI case, of course, uh, was a landmark one because the Supreme Court decided that their definition of people of Northern Marianas descent and their land laws uh, uh, were not unconstitutional, right? That the insular
Mm,
cases allows for this kind of differentiation. That the native peoples, even though they're U.S. citizens, it doesn't mean they agreed to a genocide pact.
mhm.
Uh, so, um, so I don't want us to run out of time, but I should pause in case you want to comment or add to that, Mike.
No, no, no. This is important, because what you're bringing up is what is the relationship of the territories that are currently connected to the United States? What is our relationship going to be to the United States? And and what we see is that sort of the focus on equality, as you were mentioning, basically fixes the relationship in one way. You have to be equal. You have to apply these laws in this ways, and that's why, for example, the like judges get to determine all of these things. They get to basically tell people, "Oh yeah, you're citizens," and but the problem though is that it's been how many years? It's been more than a century, more than 120 years for so many for these territory for Guam, for American Samoa. And so the question really is, after all of this time, is is that the answer? Or should the answer be, not sort of not be not sort of one size fits all, make everybody
Right.
equal, make everybody give everybody this, stamp this, do that. But should it be finally, after more than a century, and just why doesn't the United States just actually ask the people of the territories, well, what do you want? And that's what's funny, because that's what's always missing in these conversations, is that there's always this emphasis on, well, the Constitution says this. Where was all of this attentiveness to what is right and wrong and what is just and what is moral and blah, 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 when all of our lands were taken? When all of the, when, where was all this attentiveness when, when they were banning the Chamorro language in schools in Guam? Where was all this attentiveness to the Constitution and proper treatment and human rights when they came into Guam and they put a naval government in charge of the people? Where was all this attentiveness to all of these things when they came, and when after World War II, they displaced thousands of Chamorro families to build US military bases? And so the question basically is, why is it now that when the people of the territories want to actually assert what they want for the future, suddenly it becomes, no, 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 no. Here is this Constitution and here's what it says, and you have to do this, you have to do this, and you're only allowed this much. Where was all of
Um,
that? Anyway, so, but
part of the problem, Mike, is no, I hear you. I hear you. Part of the problem, like for example, I think most of the literature on decolonization and the application of the U.S. Constitution and the injustices of all that come from out of Puerto Rico, because they got like 4 million people. They have lawyers and law school professors and federal judges. They have a much bigger voice than we do, in not only in the media, but in, I'll just call them the legal circles. Uh, we don't have that much, American Samoa, we certainly don't. Uh, and so one of the things I want to say is, as far as building the Pacific Islander narrative, is besides understanding your foundation and trying to figure out self-evident truths, we need a plan for moving forward. Um, and I'm just going to go strength in numbers. I mean, we're all different, but I think uh, one of the things that we have in common is a need for legal recognition. And what I've sent you, so the part of the work, our work is, well, if I'm proposing that we look more at the narrative of Native Americans, that we fit better there, then we need to review what's been done legally, the laws that have been passed. And so there's a list, and I'm having problems pasting it in, so I'll stop pasting all of that in. You can share it with or when you have time to go through it, please go ahead. But I think we need to review the literature on the Native Americans. Now, we can't do it ourselves. I mean, we're like everybody else. You got bills to pay, and but if we can organize, if we can get the resources, if we can have more conferences like Guam had in 2019. I mean, it takes a pooling of resources and people willing to work together. So I thank you for today's podcast. But but how do we move forward? So we review the law, and then something I am calling the Native Pacific Islander Sovereignty and Self-Determination Act of 2024. Now, please understand that I am speaking as myself. This is not something coming out of the American Samoa government. Uh, but how can we move forward? Uh, how can we create a law? I mean, this has to be either work through Congress or all these different places, and the courts. I mean, and I don't know that I'm not a young man anymore. Uh, I I'm not having easiest time recruiting young people into this kind of work. Maybe it's because I think both you and I understand that it's a marathon and not a sprint. uh,
Definitely,
but uh,
definitely.
but we need to pass this on. That's probably one of our most important tasks in this. How do we get this passed on so the next person picks it up? And we have to do it quickly because things are changing real fast. But
Mm.
I believe that um, we should find common ground. Uh, I thought I was going to be able to call this up easily, but there's one thing about um, trying to do. Oh, here it is. Here it is. Uh, so I'm just going to paste in the purpose of this draft that I worked on. Uh, that the purpose of this act is to formally recognize the inherent sovereignty and self-determination of Native Pacific Islanders. And by
Okay.
Native Pacific Islanders, I mean Samoans, Hawaiians, Chamorro, to create a legal framework for the establishment of recognized Native Pacific Islander governments, their relationship with the federal government, and their right to self-governance. The tribal nations or the native tribes have a government to government relationship with the US government. Now, this is a big step. This is a huge, huge step. I don't know who would be ready for something like this. And then the next one is about providing access and getting resources to do this kind of work. But and we have members of Congress, we have our leaders in government, whether they'd want to take this up or not. But I feel that something like this needs to be done because you never know until you push it forward. And there's a lot of pushback, but at least, uh, how do I say this? I don't want to sound arrogant, but at least some people are thinking about it, right? And are working to articulate it, right? The the politicians and the community leaders and everyone they can take it and use it, but we need to articulate for ourselves some of these things.
No, this is an act that a congressional or a federal law that sort of empowers a particular sort of that empowers Pacific Islanders sort of to be self-determined or self-governed in relation to the United States. That sounds like a big improvement in terms of addressing some of the issues that we've talked about today. Because when you look at people in the CNMI, Guam, Native Hawaiians, American people, American Samoans, and so on, you have people that everybody is connected to the United States in some way, but not necessarily wanting the same things from the United States or wanting to protect certain things about what they have, or maybe wanting something a little bit different. But, and so I like that because, that's really, for me, that's always the frustration about sort of these types of issues because when we had the plebiscite case that came up, the Davis plebiscite case, the federal court, the Ninth Circuit Court, kind of looked at the case, and they talked about these issues, like how do you determine this issue? Because if you look at it from Constitution, voting rights, you decide one thing, but if you look at it in Native American law, if you look at it, let's say, international law, if you look at it like in these other ways, then you come up with something different.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's important, is that now what after 120 years there should be, you know there should be something in which we don't have to fit into some other category. After how long there should be, some way in which we get to be self-determined in this, where it's not a matter of, what, in order to figure out your destiny, you have to write a constitution that matches this, or in order to vote on your future, you have to basically only follow these directives from the Department of Justice. It's like and so it's kind of becomes meaningless after a while in terms of all these things. And so I like what you're proposing in terms of, the Pacific peoples, just come up with something in which the Pacific peoples are empowered to be self-governing and self-determined. And then, it doesn't, and then, anyways, but so I like that. And I was posting it in the chat so that
Yeah,
people can kind of see your comments.
yeah. What I'm trying to say is, if we were to see what does it look like, right? So what does this future look like that we think we should have, and just trying to do more of that. So I'm going to throw them out. This might be like a monkey wrench in the discussion. You know, in American Samoa, we're we like being a part of the U.S. Right? We uh we root for the U.S. Uh, when the United Nations started coming to Samoa, I think it was in 1990s, and telling us we were a colony, uh, people were offended. And there was an old Samoan chief, old Matai, and the way he put it, this is how he put it: Samoa, American Samoa, actually all the islands, it just got hit by a hurricane Ofa. I think this was 1990. It was bad. You know what hurricanes are like. 1 year later, we got hit. And this Matai got up and said, when these hurricanes devastated us, where was the United Nations? And he was saying in Samoan to everyone who was there, our lot is with the US, because when we needed them, they were here for us. And so, as we talk about indigenous rights and foundations, I believe that. I believe that. But everything you and I talk about, Mike, has to be for future generations. Uh, and to me, we can't take on one and give up on the other. We can't become Americans and forget about who we are in our history and in our culture and in our language. We have to somehow navigate these two worlds. So
No,
maybe
definitely.
we can open up
No,
time for if
that's
case
what I
anybody wants to. Yeah.
no, I see, and that's why I think self-determination, you know, um, it doesn't have to be independence. It can be moving away from the United States, but it can be defining a place for yourself in relationship to the United States. And so I think that's important too, is that if the people of American Samoa sort of want uh, want a particular relationship with the United States, one of the things that we see now you know, is that it's the way things are. I think a federal judge, a federal court, Congress could have the power to determine things differently, right? And so I mean, this was something that at least in Guam, in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, we tried to settle in terms of negotiating with the United States Congress around Commonwealth, in that there was a hope that we could that the government of Guam and the US federal government could agree on Commonwealth status for Guam, in which basically one of the mechanisms that the local government wanted was mutual consent, so that when federal laws are passed, Guam can opt out of them if it feels that it's detrimental to Guam, but it has the ability then to opt into laws if it feels it's beneficial. Now, of course, Congress said Congress would have a hard time
Yeah.
accepting,
Yeah.
but
Well, the
I think,
territorial clause. Yeah. I mean, none of this is easy, and none of this has
oh yeah.
uh, none of this is just black and white. But I appreciate being able to talk to you about them. Mike, I was interested if anybody else had wanted to say anything, or of your listeners, or how is that possible, or
Say that
if they
again.
wanted
Say
to.
that again.
is there anyone in your audience that had a question or?
Oh yes. Oh yes, we've had quite a few questions. In fact, we're almost out of time, but we can stay on a little bit longer to so that you can answer some questions. And so let's see here. Hungan, if you've got some questions, comment with them now, and then I will ask if you've got any questions, comment with them now, and I can ask our guest here.
I
See,
mean, it's good
Dr.
for me to know what the questions are, even if we don't have time to answer all of them.
Oh, okay, yes. Let me share. Hold on. I'm going through all of the comments and questions. Oh, I have like a bunch of screens open. I have to find them. Here it is. Okay, and so here we have one comment saying, I agree with you on equally American. They claim that they're fighting colonialism and racism while they're actually perpetuating it. And that oh, and here we go. Another comment says that Congress basically gives the power, the administrating power, the authority to determine who is a native. And so that's part of the problem, is that self-determination is compromised because Congress gets to decide who's the native and who's not the native. And then okay, and then okay, one question. So even though Hawaii is a state, would you include Native Hawaiians in terms of like a Pacific Islander Empowerment Act, like the one that we were discussing? Would you still include Native Hawaiians in an act like that, or would you not include Native Hawaiians in that?
Mike, I think we should. Now, figuring that out, who is the native Hawaiian, who is the native, that's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, no, it definitely
I think I
is.
think I think they should be included because we're in the same boat. And in American Samoa, we always point to Hawaii as what we don't want. I mean, we look up to Hawaii for the health care and the university education and uh, shopping. And I mean, yes, Hawaii's more advanced than us, or the infrastructure is so much more developed. But we also look at Hawaii as, oh man, we don't want that to happen to us. I mean, what we understand to be the alienation that happened to the Native Hawaiians and the injustices that they're fighting against today.
Uh, So here's another question. Have you thought about a treaty like Native Americans have in the past signed treaties with the United States? Have American Samoans thought about negotiating a treaty, like a new treaty with America, to try to cement your rights and your relationship?
So we have what are called deeds of cession. One was signed in 1900, and the other was signed by the Tuimanua and his Matai in 1904. So we actually have two deeds of cession. Uh, Technically, they are not treaties, but those are one of our foundational documents. And so, when we gave up our sovereignty, the treaty relationship or the covenant relationship is when two sides agree, right? And you swear an oath to be true to that. And the promise that the US made was, okay, we need to respect your right to your lands and your culture. Okay. And so for us, that's what we expect from the US. Can American Samoa as a US territory enter into a treaty relationship now? We're going to have to dig deep on that one, Mike, because we're all US territories. So
No, it's interesting. It would definitely be like a game changer. It would
yeah.
it would it would be tricky. And so one question that I definitely have, just because, for me, I'm always trying to talk to the other US territories. But for American Samoa, do you find that there's much solidarity or much kind of consciousness about what's going on in other U.S. territories, or not? Not a lot.
I think there's a in the Pacific Arts Festival that was in Guam. I think that's already good 12 years ago or something. We had this whole group of high school students travel to
Mm,
Guam, and so when that happens, we learn about Guam. Uh, we learn about Guam, and a lot of the meetings and conferences that happen in Guam out of the Department of Interior and different places. So Samoans will travel to Guam, bring back stories about Guam. That Guam is almost like Hawaii. I mean, it's just as developed as Hawaii is, right? Um, and our last political status commission in 2006, we traveled to Guam and Saipan and Palau. So that was really the first time I heard the other side of what's happening in Guam uh, uh, from the native Chamorro of Guam. That's when I first heard about these, you know, the day World War II ended, they just chased people off their lands and threw up these fences. And I need to say that as sensitively and respectfully as I can, but that's when I first heard about all of this, that uh, it wasn't easy. So it was a very, very difficult history. And as I've gotten to know you and Ed and uh, had a few chances to travel to Guam, we've learned more about Guam. Uh, both Guam and American Samoa have recently become associate members of the Pacific Island Forum. I'm sure you've heard about that. And it's like a way for the U.S. territories to learn more about the rest of the Pacific, and for them to learn about who we are. Because, I didn't know till I went to this media meeting in Fiji how much of an anti-American sentiment there was in the rest of the Pacific, how we're perceived. In fact, trying to get in the Pacific Island Forum, there were countries who were worried that we're going to be like the Trojan horse for the U.S. government. And so, but to answer your question, I think we need to do more to teach our young people about Guam and CNMI and Palau, right? Because our flights go through Hawaii, right? So we don't see that much of the Western Pacific.
Oh no, I completely understand, because for us, we don't know much about what's going on in the Caribbean or in American Samoa, and we know just because it's right next door, what's happening in the CNMI. But this is why I always appreciate people such as you and others who come onto the Fanachu podcast and talk about what's happening in different corners of the American empire, different corners of the American territories, that share their stories, so we understand how we're similar. you know we're
Yeah.
both Pacific peoples that have been connected to the United States, in ways that make us different than most people, you know but we also have different relationships to the United States too at the same time. And so I want to give you one last chance here, just if you have any final thoughts or final message kind of that you want to share, just about anything in general. Because yes, we could definitely talk. I feel like we could have a longer conversation, and I feel like we should maybe next year we'll bring our friend Ed Alvarez into the conversation too, and then
Okay.
we'll just talk and just but anyways, but yes. So final thoughts that you have to share.
Um, you got me on that one. I pretty much gave it my all here, Mike, what I have tried to say, and thank you for the time and for allowing me to say this and talk about these things. I guess I would reemphasize, because you're a teacher too, uh, and how important it is to bring young people into this discussion, um, and old people, and all people, right? That's important for us. Uh, you did ask me, just so you know, I did do some homework on the Democratic and Republican parties in American Samoa, But I gotta tell you, as soon as we go in that direction, we're going to be talking about Trump and Harris, and that's there's plenty of news about that. Uh, but as you know, we don't vote in the presidential election, so you know, uh, and a lot of the members of these parties are younger people, and they're very interested in U.S. citizenship. They're what they tell me is, Dan, how come the discussion is so binary? It's like an either or, that either we become U.S. citizens or we do something else. And is there a way to to find maybe a compromise? Is there a way to navigate between these two poles? So that's our job, Mike.
Sounds good. No, sounds good. Yeah, I agree. The talking about the US election it'll be interesting, but ultimately I always tell people that, whether you support Democrat or Republican, you always have to remember when they're talking about America, when they're talking about their plans, are they really talking about you in the territories? You know, probably not. So what does that say at the end of the day, if you're really passionate about Democrats or Republicans, what does that say? Is that, you know, um, I'd rather, believe in something concrete, so so that's why whenever somebody says, oh, Trump will protect our borders, I'm like, our borders? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
You live on an island in the Pacific. What is Trump gonna do? What did
Yeah.
Trump do there? Or what is he gonna do here? And so on. So, but that's a whole different conversation. I wonder if I will do an episode talking about presidential politics and territories. But anyways, I want to say, Jesus Masi, thank you so much for coming on to this episode. And para hamzu todos ni umeega por umeekungok, si Zeus Masi, adios. Este aquí, otro viaje, esta